Today, we're going to be talking again about everyday AI uses for researchers. And I think we have some interesting discussion points to bring up of our own personal uses, but also really excited to hear what you all have to share as well, if you're interested in sharing. So our goals today are to share experiences and also tips and tricks and brainstorm together new ways that we can use AI to be more efficient, more mindful, more transparent, and discuss important considerations because there are certain nuances for using AI and it is not always a success story. So a little bit overview for general uses, and then I'm going to hand it over to Obi. So it can certainly be helpful for ideation. You know, from our group, we've had some people who've developed really useful tools that can help us to identify novel relationships. It can also be really helpful if you're trying to come up with acronyms or titles for projects. I've certainly done that. It usually doesn't quite get me there, but it gives me some more fuel for thought. And then for code, it can be really helpful, I think, more specifically for enhancement as opposed to writing from scratch. I haven't had a lot of success with writing code from scratch, but I do think it's very helpful for annotating code, refactoring code, checking for whether we're following the best practices for security and privacy, translating from one language to another, using it to understand someone else's code that we might not be familiar with. It's extremely helpful for that. And also getting ideas for validation and testing. It can also be really helpful for project management. So it can help develop templates, break down tasks, assign roles, help us with meeting agendas and summaries. And then this sort of touches on some of the things we've talked about in some of our previous meetings, but some documents that can be helpful, like a lab handbook, code of conduct, a mentee agreement, mentee-mentor agreement. And then also visual design. Certainly a lot of us are developing software, or maybe our lab would like to have a logo, so it can be very helpful for that. If you are using it for code, some of the types of prompts that I've found to be more successful are things like, can you tell me how to make this code more readable or efficient? Can you fix the formatting and styling? Can you recommend how I could make this more reproducible or dry? Those types of prompts are generally more successful for me than, can you write this specific type of code to solve this problem? And then from a text standpoint, it can be really helpful for locating specific text within really large documents or retrieving similar text across multiple documents. It can also be helpful for adjusting communication. So I've certainly used it a lot for shifting tone in an email, making it more professional, making it more casual, making it more accessible, shifting voice for writing drafts of letter of support. So we've definitely written a lot of drafts for these, and sometimes you want it to sound like different people, and it can be helpful for that. Adjusting your presentation to make sure that you're crafting it for the appropriate audience, and also checking for clarity and accessibility. It can also be really good for simplifying text if you have a word count limit. This is something that I recently encountered for a response to reviewers. Just be careful about what you're submitting, and make sure that you're not releasing anything that you would want to keep private. Converting text into tables or other formats, and creating README files and documentation. It can be very nice for that. If you're interested in more about this, we have a course about using AI for programming. Certainly there are co-pilots that are very helpful, and we don't touch on that as much because there were fewer around and available when we wrote this. But I think that a lot of the content still works for co-pilots as well. So check that out if you're interested. It's on our website. To start discussion with everyone here, you can join our Slido here. You can either use your phone to use the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and put in 9011025. And just wanted to collect, are there other major uses that you've had with AI for these general, practical, everyday research tasks or research adjacent tasks that you'd like to share? Everything. I'd love to hear more about what everything is in case I missed some majorly helpful pieces, but that's great that you're finding it helpful. Yeah, I love it for writing documentation. It's great. I think it's great for doing the tasks that we find difficult to find time to do. Yeah, changing email tone, flyers, that's a great one. Podcasts, editing language, that's a really good one. Proposal style language, acronyms. If anyone has a really good way to request for acronyms or put the right prompt, I'd love for help. Literature search summary. Great. Yeah, and looking at errors and debugging. I really like it for that. Copilot, GitHub Copilot's really great for that sometimes. Great. A couple more people. Understanding algorithms, writing documentation. That seems to be a favorite. Tax manuals. That's great too. Okay. A couple more people. All right. Pipelines. Yep. Overviews. Great. Now we're going to shift to talk a little bit about some considerations, and then, like I said, we'll move on to some success stories and some failures, as well as some tools that are up and coming. So remember that AI is kind of like humans drawing dinosaurs based on bones alone. So this is something that an artist created, and you can see that if we don't have all the information, we can really go off in the wrong direction and not quite see the whole story. And so it's important to use very specific prompts. So as an example, can you improve this paragraph? It's okay. But if you ask how you want to be improved, maybe you want to make it more concise, maybe you want to specify an audience, that's better. So being specific and iterating can be really helpful. Some chatbots and tools allow for projects so that you can continue different contexts and have it remember what you're trying to work on, which can be really valuable. Also, we've found that typically asking AI to improve existing work often works better than starting with something from scratch. And really importantly, and we'll talk about this a lot, check everything. And the more substance and original thought that you provide, the more that you'll get back out from the product. So asking for a strategy of how to write code if you are trying to write code from scratch might be better than asking for the code itself, and also relying on some of your knowledge that you do. Again, testing and validating everything, making sure that your prompts are secure. Don't, be careful about asking questions that might leak information that you would want to keep private or that would contain PHI. Check that you're not violating any data restrictions or licensing in terms of the responses that you do use. Are you using someone's code or materials that you're not supposed to be? That can be extremely difficult, but using the right chatbots and right tools can be the way to mitigate that. And of course, always having human review. So the major challenges are, giving credit, because indeed some of these algorithms are using data and sources that they're not really supposed to. And data privacy, therefore, can also be tricky because some of them are using data that they didn't really have permission to use in the first place to train the model. There's also environmental impact. I've read some papers that are suggesting that one AI prompt, if it's not an intensive one, is about equivalent to 5 requests on Google. But if you're asking for a major task, that's obviously going to be using more computational resources. Using AI too much can degrade our trust in our own abilities and the abilities of other humans. And this can be really important for trainees who might experience, a lack of confidence in starting in the field. And of course, there's also potential for bias, even in the way that we get simple responses for the change of an email tone. So it's important to be mindful of that. So to mitigate some of these issues, we can be transparent and specific about using AI. So that can help with credit and privacy issues. We can say which models we're using, and some models will tell you how they were trained and what data they use. So shop around for different models. You don't necessarily have to stick with ChatGPT, for example. Environmental impact is, again, very real, like I said. So there are some AI tools that are actually really transparent about how resources are being used, and they also describe their attempts to improve efficiency. So consider that as well. Again, also, if AI is used too much, it can cause a lack of trust in ourselves. So read the literature about this, about the limitations, about how humans are actually still spectacular supercomputers, and be sure to talk to your trainees and about how they're using AI and how that's changing how they reflect on themselves. And then in terms of bias, ask the chatbots to consider bias in their responses and challenge them when they fail. If you're interested in more about this, we also have a course related to this. There's a mini course inside of our AI for Decisions Makers course, which has tips and prompts for both AI use and development.
Yeah, so Carrie asked me to come up with some examples of where AI is working or where it's not working, and I've been thinking of my own experiences, but also asking friends and neighbors. So I'm just going to give you hopefully a quick sampling of some illustrative cases that will hopefully prompt some discussion and other examples from the audience. Next. So this is one from relatively early where, I was filling out one of these dreaded T32, I guess like a progress report or a submission, where they ask you like to document the current role and history and funding history of every one of your past trainees, which becomes like a pretty massive task over time. And I found it really useful actually to be able to like request, say, like the CV from my trainees and then have it convert from something like this format you're seeing here that they might have listed in their CV to something like the next slide where it's in like a very specific format that the grant or the progress report is requesting. So kind of rather than spending my time doing this menial task of reformatting the text, AI is actually quite good at those kinds of tasks. You should definitely, always be aware of what you're putting into AI. So we had built a machine learning model that predicts the responses from our immunotherapy tumor board. And we had built the model in R, but we wanted to integrate it into a larger Python package. And so we use Copilot. So what she's showing here, I'm sorry, it's a little small, but on the left is an existing R script. And on the right, she's simply asking, like, can you turn this RMD file into a Python script for me? And Copilot is dutifully basically converting the R code into a fully formed Python script. And when it gets to the end, she's going to have the opportunity to save that script. It kind of explains what it did and how to use it. And she's just going to save it for later. So of course, this is useful, but does it work? Is it correct? You have to very carefully vet these things. But we were kind of amazed at how, she'd actually never written any Python before. Like she was strong in R, but had almost no Python experience. And with relatively very minor modifications, the Python version was almost completely correct. And we were able to evaluate that because we had the working R version. We had all of these evaluations against, internal cross-validation, external test sets. And we just like systematically went through every aspect of the model and its performance and showed that the new Python version was performing very similarly. So here you can see the performance on the test set was highly concordant. On the next slide, you can see the two models come with almost identical, slightly shifted variable importance ranking. You can see even the confusion matrix is quite similar. There were a few samples that shifted from one to the other class, but for the most part, they were highly, highly concordant. And actually, the Python model we found is performing slightly better. So that was a really successful example of where someone's both kind of taking their R knowledge and then quickly ramping up on how to do this sort of same thing in Python, and then just practically turning it into a piece of Python code that we could better integrate into an existing pipeline. I think the lesson here is that code generation can actually work quite well, particularly if you have an existing implementation to benchmark against and results that you can benchmark against. Another example, Carrie already alluded to this, creating acronyms. This is a real example where we had done a very large kind of atlas of single cell analysis on diffuse large B-cell lymphomas, and we'd identified these different lymphoma microenvironments that we think have different clinical relevances. And I just kind of described that situation to the AI and asked it if it could come up with a catchy name or acronym for the system. And actually the first one in the list ended up being the one that we liked, and we went with it. And that is now like in the title or abstract of the paper that has been accepted at Cancer Cell. And we're using it very widely. So that's a nice example of getting an acronym quickly. You can use it to learn just how to use like a piece of software. So in this case, I was using the Loop browser, if you're familiar with that. It's a GUI for very nicely interacting with single cell data. And I wanted to upload a specific set of cell barcodes so I could like limit my view or identify where certain cells in the UMAP were. And I could not remember how to do that. And so I asked ChatGPT, how do you import a defined list of barcodes to visualize in the Loop browser? And it gave me these instructions, and it said like, go to the categories panel. But for the life of me, I could not find the categories panel. So on the next slide, you can see me saying, like, I'm looking at the Loop browser, and I told it the version, and I said, I can't find the categories panel. And it said, oh, that's because as of V7, and therefore your version, this has been moved into the clusters mode. And then it gave me the updated instructions, and including telling you need to go to this one view and find this little upload button next to the words create a new group, which is very unintuitive, actually, in my opinion. But it really helped me find this like kind of hidden button that now serves the function that I was previously aware of for uploading some barcodes to the Loop browser. This is another example from Katie. So we were recently doing a workshop for the together, and she wanted a single image that would convey a graduate student in XKCD style with a mop kind of cleaning up their R scripts. And this is the first result she got back, and she liked it. And so this was like in her slide deck, instantly. So it can be really good for kind of cheap thrills like that, like quick graphics cartoons. Here's a little bit more complicated example where I created a figure from scratch for a review article we were working on. So we were actually writing a paper about AI and looking forward to what AI in medicine might involve. I gave it a prompt. I kind of gave it the backstory of what we're trying to do, and it created this figure for me. And this was the first image I ever saw in DALL-E at the time, and it was pretty cool, but it wasn't really what I wanted. I want something more conceptual. So I said, give me something more conceptual, and it gave me something very conceptual. I thought this was cool, but it's not really what I want. I didn't like the word hype. I thought, like, why is this person on the right, like, seemingly being, like, surgically dissected down the middle? So I gave it some further instruction, and on the next slide, you can see that it gave me something completely different. So it could, like, it really jumps around a lot, right? But I did like the evolution aspect of this and how it seemed to be showing like this evolution from simpler to more complex AI eras. So I kind of asked it to go down that avenue more. It gave me something that was closer to what I was imagining, showing this evolution from rule-based to machine learning to deep learning to generative AI, but it doesn't have the detail right. So I said, okay, this is cool, but give me these 4 categories and spelled correctly, please. This is the beginning of a long argument about how words should be spelled. You can see it kind of made like something that's really close to what I ended up with. It had kind of like 4 depictions of these different eras. Still, most of the words are messed up. So I went through a lot more prompts and then eventually got to this, which is, I thought, like really close to what I was going for, but it still had a lot of these like idiosyncratic errors. And then that's when I discovered the select and edit function. So this is really useful if you're creating images with DALL-E or ChatGPT, that you can basically highlight something and say, replace this with that. And so I did a lot of that. And then you can see the final product, which is what ended up being included in this review article. But it took a lot of prompts. So I think on the next slide, the lesson is that sometimes you need a really extended conversation. It took me like probably a couple of hours to make that figure. It's probably a lot less still than the infinite amount of time it would take me to create it the old-fashioned way, because I simply have no graphical artist skills like that at all. But it's not trivially 5 minutes either. It's still work. So these are just some more examples. Some of them are silly, some of them are real. Figuring out how to extract specific details of documentation from scikit-learn, asking it about giving me a better or a new figure caption, asking how to explain things to my kindergartner. How do I do a specific kind of grepping? How do I configure Apache for HTTPS? I think the point of this is that the previous examples I gave are neither comprehensive nor representative of the broad array of things that you can get fairly satisfying answers for from ChatGPT or similar AIs. So I use it a lot, as you can see. This is, like 1% of my queries. So they're particularly useful things people have experienced that they would like to share.
In terms of, let's see, locally installed tools, that's a great question. I think that's a great question. I can't really speak to that very well. I think that there certainly is less concern than some of these really public tools, but I know that certain institutes are doing their own instances where they can have IT really check about the security of those tools. So I think, that's a safer option, but yeah, it's a great question because some of these could be an issue as well. There are certainly some that people are using a lot more, though, than others that are probably more trustworthy.
Yeah, I think it's really tough, right? Because the tools are evolving so quickly and the
Right.
temptation to go and use them and try them is extremely high. But I think the reality is that right now, if you're going to any of the public like chatbots or whatever, you should have zero faith that whatever knowledge you put there is protected in any way. And I mean, in fact, I think
Right.
we were talking about this earlier, that as part of the New York Times lawsuit, the court ruled that OpenAI must actually retain all of their logs, even ones where you've asked for the conversation to be deleted, so that they can prove, I guess, or disprove what harm was done to New York Times. But as a result, anyone who thinks their conversation has been deleted from ChatGPT, it's not being currently deleted.
Right.
So
I
this
think
privacy issue is huge.
it's really nice for the more controlled energy expenditure of these locally installed
Mm.
tools as well. So especially thinking in terms of, what is the environmental impact too? I think it's nice to be able to have more say about some of that. But yeah, it's a little soon to tell about privacy. We could spend a long time, I think, talking about graphics and ethics for that as well. But I think that's a really important point. And it would be wonderful if these tools actually were transparent about where they collected the information to generate these images. And so we knew which artists they were and we could give them some credit and maybe even some funds. But yeah, that's not where we are.
That's a really funny anecdote about the. I hope this pleases you, my lord.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
we're gonna see something like that come up again in the subsequent slides as well. Is there anything? There's a lot of great examples that have been coming up
Yeah.
here.
Let's look at some of these together. So someone here says that they don't write code themselves. So that's really interesting and concerning because indeed making junior programmers obsolete is a problem. And, we really need to think as a field about what we want, where we want this to go. How do we want trainees to experience this as well? I think that's something that's not thought about enough. I love the converting an image flowchart into a narrative and vice versa. This format change that we've seen a little bit already can be really helpful. I often do tables to text and text tables. Asking why something makes sense is so useful. It goes much deeper than Google. I think we have to check some of it sometimes, but it certainly is a great starting point for that. Suggestions for how to do something, indeed. And yeah, I always use it for editing content to fit a word limit if I can. I did really like someone in the chat talked about, and this is in the courses as well, that it's really important to ask what assumptions the AI chatbot is using and challenging them regularly, I think is very good. I'm going to move on to our cautionary examples, which are interesting. You'll see.
Yeah, so this is one that Malachi shared with me, which I thought was illustrative. So, I mean, he was kind of just playing around. I have this sequence and I want to reformat it. So give it back to me with a new line every 100 characters. And that seemed to work well. Then he was trying something a little more complicated where he had a sequence that had these square brackets in it that were indicating something. And he was like, okay, give me the reverse complement of this sequence, maintaining the square brackets. And on the next slide, you can kind of see it gave him this, like a very sensible looking result with a very clearly explained plan, like I will identify the position of the brackets, I'll remove them, I'll reverse complement, and I'll put them back in at the right place. And then on the next slide, you can see that it produced a very sensible looking result. And it even remembered that he liked to have his sequence with 100 bases per line, even though that wasn't part of this prompt. And it asked him if he'd like to have it in FASTA format, which is very nice. But then he did some QC, and there's just one problem. It had introduced a lot of mutations into the DNA. So for whatever reason, it was introducing insertions and deletions and substitutions. So, this is a kind of catastrophic failure, like failing to recognize the most important thing, which would be the fidelity of the sequence. And probably an example where maybe this is just not something where AI is worth it. Another example from Malachi that was really illustrative, he had asked about an ensemble filter, the filter VEP tool, and he wanted to know how the soft filter option works. And it gave, again, a very nice explanation that when you use the soft filter, variants will not be hard filtered. They'll be left in your VCF, but they'll be marked as filtered, and it'll give it a name of the, why the variant was failed. Or you could specify a custom name with this -filter name parameter. But Malachi could not find any documentation on this -filter name. So on the next slide, he asked it, where is the filter name parameter documented? And ChatGPT was like, you're right to ask. The option is not currently documented, but trust me, it's real and it's supported, and here's some evidence for it. If you look in the source code, it's there. If you try using it, if you run the tool and give the soft filter option, it'll work. And there's some hidden undocumented options, like if you run with --help, it'll show you that it's there. And it turns out all three of these are lies. So it's just making up a rationalization for why the filter name kind of should exist, but it doesn't exist. And what it's describing is how the tool should work, but the tool works in a different way, and kind of an unfortunate way that's actually violating the VCF specification. So there's like a good reason why the way it describes it existing should exist, but it's not reality. So this is like a very severe hallucination example. So the lesson is sometimes AI is just telling you what you want to hear. I think that's a very common property of the current AIs, that they like to please. This is an example that Adam provided. So something useful you can do with ChatGPT, for example, or I think he was using Copilot, is you can provide images and have them turned into useful documents. So in this case, I think on the next slide, he's talking about how we have this application. He's probably talking about Civic, where it's a Ruby on Rails web app. And when we're making new features, sometimes the developers like to mock them out in diagram format and then convert them into Rails migration file, for example. And you can actually create the diagram, create the schema, and then just upload it into an AI and ask it to auto-generate like an active record migration file, for example, which is super useful. And he's asking it to document any assumptions and pitfalls. On the next slide, you can see the result of that, where it does say, okay, I can help you do this. And there's a very long list of assumptions and pitfalls, which I don't expect you to read. But you can see that his conclusion was, did produce the migration file. And actually, his assessment of it was that it was mostly correct. And so it did probably save some time. But there were issues and minor errors. And the kind of most glaring is right in the very first line of the record is that it's not actually using the right version of Rails that was specified, despite kind of repeating back like, oh, you want it in Rails 8, but then it's not, it's Rails 7. So again, you need to check the bot's work very carefully because it can introduce small or large errors throughout the product. Here's a couple more amusing examples on the figure sphere. So Malachi, again, was trying to create an image that would explain the difference between peptide MHC binding, processing, presentation, and immunogenicity. And he got this kind of like graphical salad that's mostly meaningless and like full of errors and oddities. But to give it like another chance, he did want to correct his mistype. So he'd said something like create the delicious image that depicts the difference. So all he did was correct the prompt to remove that word delicious. And strangely, instead of recognizing that he was removing an error, it actually added a burger into the slide, I guess, based on the previous mention of deliciousness. So on the next slide, he said, this is cool, but let's tone down the deliciousness. But it still kept the burger there. It didn't understand that kind of tongue-in-cheek instruction. So he was more direct, and he's just like, get rid of the burger, please. And this is what it produced, a slide with only a burger. So you can really see that the image generation capabilities are very bleeding edge here with this example. So I guess the lesson, we've covered some of these already, but the AIs, they do remember things you've said. So that was alluded to in the chat, and that can have unexpected results, sometimes good, but sometimes nonsensical. And this is a funny one that was going around as well. Just a final warning to remember you can't lick a badger twice. So what this is illustrating is that if you ask AI to explain an idiom, even one that doesn't exist, it will often just go ahead and give you an answer like, oh, this idiom is used to explain that you can't trick or deceive someone a second time because they've been tricked once already, and that's not a real idiom. So are there any negative AI experiences inspired by the previous example or otherwise that the group wants to share? We're seeing lots of good stuff in the chat as well. Yeah, Dexter's making the point that things are changing very rapidly, and even DALL-E is already deprecated.
Yeah, I think that was a great response too about the sequence example of like asking for code.
Yes.
And making it sort of a second intermediate step.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice. I think it's a good question about whether, sometimes the issues are from the use or overuse of long context windows. If you forget to create a focused project or just continue on in a chat window where you're asking completely unrelated questions, it could sometimes have weird results where it's kind of stupidly attempting to incorporate things you were thinking about previously on an unrelated topic.
Perhaps burgers.
Yes, delicious burgers. Random PMIDs.
Yes, that's so true. It's gotten a little better over time, but certainly ChatGPT is very bad about giving you false citations and references, which is disappointing because then you're excited and then the paper doesn't exist. Misleading treatments, that's a very good point. The impact on healthcare is probably really large. Great.
I guess we should go through just the last couple of slides since we just have 5 minutes left. So we thought we would just show some new emerging, and I think I was going to steal the screen. So the first thing I wanted to share, if you aren't already familiar with, is Google Notebook LM. So this is a Google product, obviously, and one thing that's really nice about it is that it allows you to have a ChatGPT-like interaction, but with a set of sources or content that you control. So this is just one example of how I've used it recently. A colleague proposed a collaboration with exome sequencing to investigate the mutational landscape of a specific kind of parathyroid disease. And I kind of want to know like what's already known about the mutational landscape. And so I did a Google search and identified about 20 papers, and I just uploaded those papers into Notebook LM. And I'm going to try a live demo. So these are the papers that I just dumped into here. So you can just, add a source. You can add docs from your Google Drive. You can add links to websites or YouTube videos. You can directly paste in text. And then you can just start asking it questions like you would at ChatGPT, but the answers you'll get back will be essentially entirely informed by the sources that you've limited it to. For example, you could ask it like to summarize the field of whole exome sequencing and create a table that kind of shows the studies and how many samples and what tumor types were profiled and that sort of thing. You could ask it, I had somewhere in here a question like about the gaps in the field, and we're specifically interested in this multiglandular disease, and it did a pretty nice job of summarizing what has been kind of comprehensively sequenced versus what maybe is still kind of understudied in the field. And then the last thing you can do, fortunately it always wants to load, is you can create like a kind of podcast audio overview of the documents. And if this doesn't take too long. Welcome to the deep dive. It creates this kind of corny but informative audio summary of your materials.
Talk about the small glands in your neck, what's regulating calcium. Exactly, and sometimes they develop growths. Benign, mostly, but sometimes cancerous. Understanding the genetic changes behind this is
so you can hear it sounds a lot like your favorite podcasters, right? But it is kind of entertaining and informative. And we actually shared this with the collaborators. They sat around like a conference table and listened to it. They used the chat interface, and it really helped us quickly kind of guide the collaboration and get us to the specific questions that we wanted to address and get us on the same page. Other things we've used for putting all the docs for Civic into one place so that you can ask, like basically have a help chatbot for how does Civic work and what's in the docs. And then the last thing, this is something I've just been playing with in the last few days, someone actually reached out to us, a random person that we don't know, and said, hey, I created a model context protocol server for Civic and DGIDB, which are tools that our lab generates, and pointed us to these Git repos with instructions on how to start up these servers. And when you do that, you can then go to Claude Desktop. So right now, Claude supports these MCPs. You can do a pretty simple config where you point Claude at these servers, and then you can ask questions of, in this case, Civic. So I could say something like, what is the clinical relevance of this particular fusion? And it directly interacts with the Civic knowledge base. It creates GraphQL queries. It shows you the query. It shows you the response. It goes through a thought process and builds like a SQLite database. If it gets large results back and further queries that, and eventually gets you to like a pretty sensible answer for a lot of the questions I've been asking, but driven by the knowledge in your database. So that's kind of a really cool example of a technology that I think is going to be everywhere soon.